Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt, and we got a couple of our usuals today. We have Mr. Joel Hermansen, who hit it big this week when the pick three numbers were 547, one big. Also with us is Dr. Allison McCoy-Fleshman, whose latest research paper is the quantum entanglement of unwanted bar conversations. Congratulations on that paper.
Peer-reviewed.
And our real special guest this week. So this was an article that I came across, and I was like, we have to have this guy in the show. We have Dr. Anton Howes with us. He is a historian of innovation. He is the guy behind the Age of Invention newsletter. And you wrote an article, a rather lengthy one, I should add.
Yeah.
And I know that the focus was not on beer and brewing. It was really on the adoption of coal as a unit of energy, or as a source of energy. And I'm not going to paraphrase it for you. I'll let you do that. But I thought it was very fascinating. We've talked many times about the history of beer on this podcast, about how beer was fundamental for the development of civilization back in the early days of agriculture, that beer was developed as a store of calories, that beer probably came before bread, may have been one of the reasons that agriculture started. But your take on it is that beer and brewing may have had a role to play in the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And so welcome to the show, and I'll let you take it from there if you want to kind of give a summary of your thesis.
Thank you. Yes. So for listeners, I'll give just a brief overview of this. I think it's about 8,000, 9,000 word piece, so it's definitely on the longer side.
I've been reading it for 2 weeks. It was really good, though.
The brewing bit's at the end, so I hope you enjoy it when it gets to that bit. Basically, I wanted to find out why it is that Britain in particular adopts coal in a really, really big way, because this is fundamental to the Industrial Revolution. When we think about the adoption of coal, we think about steam engines, but long before that, in the 1570s, 80s, up to about 1600. So Shakespeare's London, to put it in those kind of terms. Shakespeare's London makes the switch from burning wood in people's everyday homes to burning coal. And the standard narrative, a narrative that I've even written about myself and kind of put it in these terms many times, is that essentially what happened is that there's a change in the hearth, in people's homes. There's the adoption of chimneys with longer flues. There's the adoption of chimney backs, which is kind of cast iron plates that you put at the back of the chimney to reflect some of the heat back in. You've got the narrowing of chimneys because wood fires versus coal fires. Wood fires, you want a nice wide hearth. Coal fires, you want a nice narrow one. And essentially, the main argument is that you'll often hear from historians of technology, economic historians, or even just in the kind of popular treatments of this subject, is that it's to do with a change in the home, a kind of domestic revolution, if you like. And when I started looking into it, the problem is it didn't actually sound like the evidence stacked up to that. And what you actually see is that the first thing to happen is, rather than London being the driver of this coal revolution in people's homes, you instead see coal being adopted in people's homes near the places where it's dug, which is kind of what you'd actually expect. So right back into the Middle Ages, the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, places like Newcastle are burning coal near people's homes. Maybe even actually goes way further back than that's possible. I mean, there's inconclusive archaeological finds from Roman sites even suggesting that there seems to be some kind of coal burning going on. Unclear whether that's blacksmiths who are using coal for a very long time, lime burners perhaps, possibly however, they're also using it in the home. And what actually happens in London is that London makes the switch to coal first through brewing. And the reason for that, and this is the reason it's such a long post, is that I go into dive really into the detail here, which is to try and work out why it is that a certain invention, first invented in Germany, in Strasbourg, which I guess is kind of now considered border of France and Germany. They've fought, world wars over Strasbourg, so I should be careful where I say it is. But at the time, it's very firmly in the Holy Roman Empire. It's part of what would be considered Germany at the time. And in Strasbourg, they come up with essentially a way of heating homes, heating kitchens, heating whatever you like, by separating the actual fire bit from where the heating's going on. So the heating is being transferred, the heat itself is being transferred via the flue as it's taking away all of the soot, as it's taking away all of the smoke. And that's applied just to wood. There is a bit of a wood shortage in Germany. It's quite difficult to expand wood supplies. And so it's the kind of place that you'd expect one of these innovations to take place. And essentially, the switch gets made in Britain rather than just using this for burning wood. But brewers very, very quickly realize that they can start burning coal, which has extremely acrid, sulfurous smoke. It's extremely, I mean, if you try to just burn coal in a normal hearth in your home without any of the specialized equipment that's invented around this stage as well, or is adopted around this stage as well, you would essentially have to leave the room within seconds, probably, because you just have this acrid, sulfurous. I mean, the moment it makes contact with the water in your eyes, it suddenly will create a light acid, and so cause stinging. I mean, coal is this really, really nasty thing. But by separating essentially the heating from the grate where you're actually stoking the fire, that allowed brewers to be able to adopt coal, which is significantly cheaper than wood in brewing. And there's such a massive energy saving that you see in brewing, particularly for beer versus ale, and perhaps we'll get into those sorts of definitions.
So this new technique was developed in Germany initially, if I recall correctly, as a wood saving measure.
Yes.
Because this was just a cost savings measure for the brewers to save money on wood, on their energy costs.
So it seems to be for all kinds of wood burning industries. So it could be in the home. So you see in Germany these kind of lovely tiled stoves where you'll have the stove in the living room, and then I guess the servant in the room next door will have the bit where they're actually stoking the fire. So the smoke will kind of enter from the other room into the room where you are with your lovely tiled stove. It won't actually enter into the atmosphere of the room, if that makes sense, and then get passed up through the chimney separately. So that's one of the ways it can be used, kind of stove ovens, they're called Stubenofen. Or you can use it in kitchens, you can use it in brewing. I mean, they mention in the patents in Germany in the 1550s, which is when this is happening, that it could be used for all sorts of different things. They want to cover all their bases, but it seems to be most popular amongst brewers in particular because it's energy is one of the big constraints in terms of how much they can produce.
Dr. Howes, can I come back to when you were talking about the unpleasant, acrid nature of coal smoke?
Yeah.
There was a part of your Substack in which you were talking about the Queen visiting the riverfront where all of the breweries were. I think our audience would love to hear your interpretation of that because I found it to be fascinating.
Sure. So one of the reasons we know that coal is adopted by brewers very early on, it's actually pretty much the first solid evidence we have of coal burning in London, is that the brewers are called before the Privy Council of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I, and they're told, look, the Queen doesn't like this horrid smell that's coming from your chimneys. She's no longer visiting London. She's no longer coming to the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament is. She's no longer coming to the Palace of Whitehall either. And so she's just avoiding London as a result of just the stink of the nearby breweries. And there's a couple of times that this happens, but essentially it sounds as though the brewers offer her the possibility that they'll switch back from coal to wood for the two breweries closest to the palace, or two or three, they say. They're being generous. But they point out just how massive the wood saving is, saying, look, it's this tens of thousands of billets of wood, vast tracts of forest potentially that we're saving here by using coal instead. And wood that can be used by people in their homes instead as well. So yes, there's a kind of, the royal nose was very displeased.
So if I'm interpreting this correctly, brewers are environmentalists.
I would say so.
By burning dirty coal.
By saving wood.
Saving wood. I just did a quick look of the chemical byproducts of coal, and it's various ash, of course, but then flue gas desulfurization materials and gases like carbon dioxide, which fine, but sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. So some of especially the sulfur dioxide, acid rain is going to happen from that, and it's not fun at all to have that kind of byproduct. So I think as much as it's, yes, we are, saving wood, but I think the technologies that come from this to get that stuff out, it's kind of like the catalytic converter in the car engine, like all these different ways to get the byproducts out. So the the birth of this technology is fascinating.
Well, I dare
And
say
actually-
this was not even bad compared to what happened in London later on.
Oh, the
mean,
big stink.
Oh yeah.
Throughout the 19th century, and even was it 1952 was the Great Fog
Mhm.
that eventually caused restrictions on coal to be burning to be put in place.
Oh,
Right.
when are we in this shift to coal burning? We're in the 14th.
Dr. Howes is talking about the 16th and 17th century primarily.
So that's in
That's
the
right.
heart of the little ice age, isn't it? In Europe.
I thought that was in the 14th century. That
Oh, yeah, I think you're right.
So I don't know, just colder winters.
I
Okay.
think it's 17th century. There's at least one of the mini ice ages that's been identified. The one thing I will say about on the environmentalist element, though, is ironically the adoption of coal, although it saves wood, means that actually there's quite a bit of deforestation. So I originally actually got into this question at all because one of the really common narratives that you'll see on documentaries, museums, I mean, absolutely everywhere, is that Britain had a wood shortage and so they adopted coal in people's homes. And actually, it's exactly back to front. What actually happens is that loads of landscapes were essentially maintained so that they could be for fuel. So you'd have marshlands so that you could use peat or turf. You had heaths so that you could use gorse and furze and various other stuff people could burn. And you had forests or woodlands so that people would have enough wood growing all the time for their homes. And so when coal comes along in this big way and starts saving all of this wood, it suddenly means that a shift occurs where suddenly people go, okay, well, I guess we don't need this woodland anymore. We'll just chop it down and convert it into arable land or pasture.
wow.
So you've got this huge swathe of deforestation, which later on people start to think, oh, if you read a lot of people at the time, they do put the blame on people's greediness, or they say, we're being really short-sighted by cutting down the woodlands. But ironically, that actually only ever happens when there is a coal shortage or a disruption to the coal supply, which suddenly makes everyone pine for the way that things were. But it's already too late by then for them to go back.
One of the things I wanted to ask about was the importance of brewing during this period, during the Elizabethan age. If without knowing anything, if you were to ask me what industry at that time would probably be the first coal adopter, I would have said probably blacksmithing. Because they require high heat. That would make sense. How big and how important was brewing at that time that this led the change to coal?
So you are right, actually, that blacksmithing is the first to adopt it. So there are two industries, one larger, blacksmithing, and one smaller, which is lime burning. So this is lime for mortar, to put between your bricks or your stones. And that's pretty small. Blacksmithing is pretty large. In fact, blacksmithing as a demand for coal is an international demand. I mean, there's documents from the 1550s talking about how France is entirely reliant on British coal, so from both Scotland and England, for its blacksmiths. So every time France goes to war against the Holy Roman Empire or whoever, there's a huge demand for blacksmithing coal. But that's really ancient. So that goes back, really quite a great distance. And so what happens in the 1580s or 90s is that the adoption of coal by brewers pretty much doubles London's demand for coal straight away, just from that kind of the single industry changing that. And the key element here in terms of why it then continues to progress is that basically for centuries, blacksmiths and lime burners had been using coal. And near places where it was dug, people had been burning coal in their homes. And certain grades of coal are much easier to burn in people's homes because there's less sulfur content in them. They're more like kind of a rock-like anthracites and so on, and that can be just easier to adapt to or easier to adopt. The reason that, or I believe at least, the reason that brewing kind of signals this big step change is that by massively increasing the demand for coal specifically from places like Newcastle, where it'll be shipped all the way down to London, is that they start digging deeper and deeper and finding bigger and bigger and kind of higher quality coals that will be fit for the home. And so almost as a kind of accidental byproduct, they discover these much better coals in this area where traditionally it had just been this much cakier, much more sulfurous coal that had only been fit for blacksmiths and really only fit for things like salt burning and so on, where it's kind of, salt burning or salt boiling, they would use what are called pan coals, which is the lowest grade of coal, the worst, crumbliest, almost like the stuff that you've dug up for other coals, and whatever's left over at the mine is the stuff that you can just chuck under a salt boiling pan. So by digging deeper and discovering these greater coals, as they're called, great coals, large coals. That's why I think London suddenly adopts coal as well in the home. And once you've got this massive use of coal, loads and loads of coal coming down to London all the time, other industries start to get interested as well. So glass making, you've got increasing adoption of it in whatever metallurgical industries you can think of, brick burning, all sorts of different other ones. I mean, also in the 17th century, so by about the 1640s and 50s, you also then have the adoption of coal even in malt drying. So kind of another step back from the brewing bit, which interestingly is the one that lots of people have heard of, because they know of pale ales, and they kind of have this story about coal in the back of their head. So I had a few questions after I wrote the piece being like, well, what about this whole thing to do with malt? It's like, well, no, actually, it's specifically what I'm talking about here in the 1580s to 1600 is the adoption of coal in all the boiling that you have to do just in the actual brewing process itself, because brewers wouldn't have been doing malting themselves. They'd have bought malt straight from the maltster.
Yep.
And then from then it's a completely separate thing.
Well, likewise, we still do that here. And reading about how, from your piece, the invention being so valuable to brewers and making beer, shaving 2 hours off the entire process of bringing the liquids up to the boil. And for a modern professional brewery, 2 hours, oh my gosh, that's...
But the amount of
worth its
off
weight.
flavors that could develop, the obviously it's efficient. It's more efficient, but what it does to the taste of the beer, if you can make it more efficient. You mentioned in that little bit down from where Dr. McCoy-Fleischman is, you mentioned a little bit about, the use of these technologies in brewing. I'm wondering if you have any perspective about, because we recently had one of your British neighbors on, Mr. Charlie Bamforth, who's the professor of brewing at UC Davis. He's from England. And we asked him this question, and I have to ask it of you as well. What do you think a 16th century beer would have tasted like? And do you think you would have enjoyed it?
That's a great question. So from what I recall, because I did have to read a few recipes just to kind of make sure when I was because there's a bit in the piece where I describe the process. One thing that's interesting is that they like to add a kind of range of grains to things just for extra flavor. So I guess there would have been a few oats, a few other like little bits that are kind of added at different stages. I suspect that in general, before this change, beers would have been significantly weaker, just because the less energy intensive it can be, the more you're going to produce of that stuff. So if you suddenly save loads in terms of your fuel costs, then the strength of beer is likely to go up significantly. And I suspect that part of the shift from ale to beer, which also takes place in this period in Britain, is also partly that this just narrows the gap in terms of the cost difference between ale and beer, because you've got to have that second boiling for beer, which you don't require for ale. So in terms of narrowing that cost gap, I suspect that's a big part of it. So I suspect that before this, you have a lot more ales. It's a lot weaker in general. And then in terms of the beers that you do get, they start to get significantly stronger.
And they're going to be smokier. Is that based on the evolution of the use of coal? They're going to get some of those acrid notes from...
So I don't know how much would get through, given it.
But isn't it in the malting too, though?
So the malting, that would happen later. So in the mid-17th century, you're potentially going to start to get some flavour changes from the adoption of coal and malting. But in this period, they still would have just been using... typically, I think they'd have used straw rather than even wood. I think it's very light kind of kindling stuff. I guess gorse and furs, perhaps.
Wow.
From what I recall, it would be mainly straw. So yeah, maybe you've got some kind of rich kind of grassy notes in there from what's happening in the malting, but I'm definitely not an expert on the chemical.
Definitely not taste like it does now.
No. And whenever we did an episode on IPAs, the origin story. We've done a number of like origin story episodes, and we always kind of come back to, would we like this beer? And Bobby always says yes, because Bobby is such a nice guy. But Charlie was, I don't think we would have enjoyed that beer.
Well, obviously London did, because it, invested in this entire industry to help fuel it, pun intended. So
Right.
I don't know. I think it would have been better than the water.
Very, very true.
Speaking of which, and this might be a little bit beyond your area of expertise, what role do you think beer, perhaps more broadly alcohol, had in the rise and of the Industrial Revolution for your average working stiff in England? Because there's a very established pub culture in Britain, and how much of that was a result of working people during the Industrial Revolution?
I mean, I'm going to both answer that and also the earlier question, which I realized I failed to answer, which is about the significance of the industry. Beer is massive at the time, right? So if we think about people's daily expenditures, people are, after food, which is taking up, the majority of people's expenditure, right? Which is, I think, very difficult for us to even kind of fathom today, in that food, even if we take out eating out at restaurants, whatever, and just talk about, our home groceries, in most wealthy countries today, or most of the world today even, people are at most spending about 10 to 15% on food. At the time, I think even in the poorest country in the world, it's something like 55%. At the time, people are spending on food and drink about 75 to 85% of their annual expenditure. So in terms of your income, whenever your paycheck's coming in, if almost all of that's just going on food, food and drink, and so that's including basically quite a lot of beer, quite a lot of ale that's going into that as well. So it's an absolutely massive thing. And I think one way to talk about the Industrial Revolution is that there's this dramatic increase in living standards taking place over the course of the 16th to the 19th centuries, which is continuing to this day, right? And one of the biggest things you can do at the time to improve people's living standards is essentially any technology that even marginally improves the affordability of food or the affordability of drink. So these sorts of things that make it much, much cheaper to get better food or drink is, I think, going to have an outsized impact in the way that it's very difficult to imagine any technology today having. So that's, I think, one of the big things to kind of bear in mind there, is that, yes, it's very large. And as a knock-on effect of the adoption of coal, the other thing to bear in mind here is that, I mentioned that by coal becoming cheaper and becoming this kind of mass adopted thing, first in the breweries and then in people's homes, by clearing away all this woodland and being able to use all of that land for agriculture, you at the same time not only get the kind of coal energy abundance, but you get a grain energy abundance as well in England and Scotland. And so within Britain, over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, people very quickly start to notice, foreign visitors will come along and be like, everyone's like really fat, they're eating absolutely loads, they're having these huge meals, they're drinking all the time. I mean, the Brits are almost famous for these kind of massive hours-long lunches, which, extend well into the day, where they're just gorging themselves all the time. I mean, even visiting aristocrats from other countries are just amazed at the sheer volumes of what are essentially the results of a kind of grain energy abundance. And if we think of grain as being, actual fuel for muscle, it's not just what's going into people's daily calories, but also into the kinds of animals that they're using. So a lot of the early mechanization that you see in the 17th, 18th centuries is horse-powered. And there's absolutely tens of thousands of horses in London that are doing all of the kind of any circular work, any grinding work, or any kind of stuff that you can replace with horsepower is done very, very quickly, even before, long before steam engines start to change the game still further. So that grain abundance is a very, very, very big deal. There's actually a bit that I used pretty early on in the piece, even just talking about, this is from two dukes' sons from France, French dukes, the sons of French dukes. In fact, one of them becomes the duke himself after his father dies, commenting in amazement at how everybody has horses, in the same way that I guess in 1960s America, if you were from, the Soviet Union or something, you'd be amazed at just the sheer level of car ownership. To 1760s, 1770s French duke's sons, if you're visiting Britain, you're amazed that even the poor farmer has like a spare horse to go into market, and his wife has another horse as well, where they can just go off on trips, and they're not just using a horse for ploughing the fields. So that kind of energy abundance is, I think, quite fundamental to a lot of the living standards increases that we see in the Industrial Revolution.
And that's going to conclude this episode of Respecting the Beer. This is only half of the conversation with Dr. Anton Howes. Be sure to tune in next week as we finish out the conversation and really find out why brewers were so vital to the industrialization of coal. The producer of Respecting the Beer is me, David Kelso. Make sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player so you don't miss an episode, and feel free to join the Facebook group to get updates between episodes. And you can listen to the full conversation with Dr. Howes over on Patreon right now. You can get a 7-day free trial, and if you like it there, you can continually support the show for as little as $4 a month. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, please remember to respect the beer.